Okay, we are live on Facebook, and I'm going to do my silly little theme song now. It's Nosh and Schmooze, Nosh and Schmooze, where we talk about cool stuff concerning the Jews and everybody else. Welcome, everybody, to Nosh and Schmooze. I'm so happy you're able to join us here today. We have a very special guest, and I'm here with Liz Kleinrock discussing how to help stop the hate against the AAPI community. And as always, if you have questions or comments for Liz, please leave them in the comments section on Facebook, and I will field your questions to her. But first, a bit about my guest. Liz Kleinrock is an anti-bias, anti-racist educator and consultant based in Washington, D.C. A transracial adoptee, Liz was born in South Korea and grew up in DC. She has served as an AmeriCorps teacher with Girls Inc. and Superstars Literacy. She also taught 5th grade in Watts and 1st through 4th grades at a startup school in East Hollywood. In addition to classroom teaching, Liz also works as an anti-bias, anti-racist facilitator for schools, organizations, and companies across the country. In 2018, Liz received Teaching Tolerance's 2018 Award for Excellence in Teaching and currently serves on the Teaching Tolerance Advisory Board. So thank you so much for joining us today, Liz. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And, unfortunately, I think that many Americans were not taking racism against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders seriously until the recent attacks in Georgia. Can you break down for us how racism against the AAPI community has taken a drastic turn for the worse throughout the pandemic?
Sure. I think it's first really important to note that racism against Asian Americans is not anything new, or Asian immigrants. This has been a part of our country's fabric and history ever since folks of the Asian diaspora landed in what we now call the United States. I do think, though, that like many different ideas, things evolve over time and take different forms and shapes, even though the root cause of it remains the same. Um, Throughout the pandemic, we heard a lot of extremely harmful and hateful rhetoric from our former president. And while I would never give him all of the credit for, causing all of this to happen, I do think that it's also important to recognize that when people are in positions of power and influence and have enormous platforms, you kind of set a tone for what's acceptable, what people can say in public, and what people feel comfortable that they can get away with too. So when we hear rhetoric around, the China virus or Kung flu, and use one particular ethnic group as a scapegoat, it empowers a lot of people to participate in really harmful, violent forms of language and behavior. Right now, we're seeing, I wouldn't say like a rise in hate crimes, but I would say increased visibility on hate crimes that are impacting the Asian American community, particularly folks of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent. And I think it's also really important to make that distinction. We're seeing a lot of xenophobic remarks. I think something that a lot of Asian Americans can relate to is being labeled a perpetual outsider. And this is actually an intersection where I feel, as an Asian and Jewish person, there's a lot of commonality here, that there's always this idea or implication that folks who are Jewish and folks who are Asian are always going to be seen as loyal to another country, loyal to another place, and are not actually loyal to the United States. I think I might have gotten off topic from your original question. I went on kind of a tangent.
It's all relative. But yeah, specifically, I think there's been, at least like you say, a rise of visibility of racism and hate crimes against elderly folks who are Asian Americans throughout the pandemic. And like you said, this is not a new issue. And it's interesting, I think back to movies that I saw probably in film class in high school, like Breakfast at Tiffany's. And that, yeah, exactly. And it's like, it seems where there has been sensitivity in mainstream culture around racism and racist depictions of people of color. in like of other, people of color, that you wouldn't see like someone in blackface necessarily in the 1960s Hollywood, but it was okay for like Mickey Rooney to portray a Japanese man in this like terrible depiction. It seems like it was like something that was overlooked, or it was still okay to be racist towards, Asian Americans in this country after World War II. Whereas like people were like, Nazis are bad, but we can still like act like this towards, Japanese Americans. So, why is that, and how can we rectify this?
Well, I think a lot of like forms of racism are deemed acceptable or unacceptable depending on, folks' education, if they are doing enough work to correct their ignorance. I think in terms of like overt versus covert forms of racism, there's still a lot of things that people deem acceptable, within communities of color and folks who have historically been marginalized. We talk a lot around like cultural appropriation and what that actually means, but a lot of folks who don't identify with those groups don't think there's anything wrong with it. And I think that we've seen some evolution in people's thoughts that like now, even 5-10 years ago, the majority of mainstream America wouldn't think there's anything wrong with, wearing a native headdress if you don't identify as native, or speaking in African American vernacular English if you don't identify as a member of the Black community. I think when it comes to, depictions not only of Asian folks, but like non-Black people of color, we've seen acceptance there. If you look at movies like West Side Story, like how many Latin folks do you actually see in that movie? And that is, still held up as like a really influential, like classic film. I think of movies like The Good Earth, and that was a book that I'm sure teachers might still point to and say, like, this is Asian history, even though it's written by a white woman. And in that movie, the actress Anna May Wong campaigned really, really hard to have a really pivotal role in that film. And she was still passed over in favor of a white actress. And you don't see a lot of Asian representation in this movie that actually takes place in Asia. um, I'm hoping that with more, visibility and dialogue that we're seeing around representation, it's not just, the people we see on screen, but also who's actually in control of these narratives. Like, who are the people within film and media who make the decisions about production, who writes it, who directs it, not only what story are we telling, but who is in control of telling that story.
Yeah. And I feel like, with Raya and The Last Dragon just coming out, and like there were a lot of Asian and Asian American actors that were represented in that film. And I think like the first maybe openly transgender actor in a Disney film and things like that, like that's exciting too. Hopefully we're seeing a turn in that, but there's obviously still a lot of work to be done. So you mentioned, you are a Jewish Asian American woman. That ticks a lot of minority boxes. How has this uptick in visibility of hate crimes against the AAPI community affected you personally?
I mean, it's been awful. I think I've had therapy 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I've been having difficulty sleeping, just have like a a lot of like heightened anxiety. I often feel nervous going out and doing things that I am very used to doing, like, walking to Target, going to the grocery store. And I think particularly after what we saw last week in New York, that Filipino woman who was like kicked to the sidewalk while people watched, not only this anxiety of what if somebody says or does something to me, but also the anxiety of what if nobody does anything? Like, what if nobody steps in? What would I do, or what would happen? Um, I think like being a person of color in the United States, you deal with this nuance of being like hyper visible at times and also completely erased too. And that's certainly something that I'm feeling in my identity as an East Asian woman, that for what feels like the first time there is a spotlight, there is visibility on what is happening to like the Asian American community and issues that we are facing and have been facing. I personally feel that there's like an enormous amount of pressure to speak out on it. And I also have a lot of fear in if I step back, if I feel like I need to engage in self-care and, not go on social media, not take media requests or do interviews, I have this fear that if I don't say something now, then like the moment's going to pass. People will just move on. And will they ever come back to this? Like, will they ever care again? So I feel this really ridiculous, like irrational fear and pressure to speak out now, to do as much as I can, even though I'm also aware that it's taking a toll on my mental health.
Hmm. I hear you and I see you, and I want you to know that the community at Temple Bethel of Hollywood supports you, and I hope that you're getting the support that you need in DC. So that being said, what can the Jewish community do locally here in South Florida, but also nationally to stop the hate?
Yeah, I think, and so like when I do diversity and inclusion work within Jewish organizations and spaces, since usually in the United States, we're looking at like Ashkenazi communities, not all, but that's like the dominant narrative. And that is the majority within the United States. Then when we talk about like coalition building and solidarity movements, to make sure that we're not using language around like the Jewish community helping Asians, because there are Asian Jewish people. And it's really important to recognize that intersectionality within our communities. I would think about first like education. Something that I feel like I've said a lot over the past few weeks is, if you are a product of US education, doesn't matter if you went to an independent school, a private school, a charter, a public school, chances are you didn't learn anything about Asian history or Asian American history. And clearly, like, what you don't know. But when you are aware of these gaps, in your understanding, if you realize that you're ignorant about a certain perspective or history, it's now on you to do something about it. Anyone I think can really easily look up, books about like Asian narratives or like Asian American history. For those who might feel like financial constraints, like there are a number of like free documentaries and podcasts that people can engage with as well. And to really think about, like, if you have been engaging in anti-racism work, as we have seen since last spring and summer, there has been increased visibility on like this lens and developing this type of activism. And quite often for folks, it exists along like this black-white binary, but it's really important to remember that racial justice and anti-racism isn't just about the relationship between like Black folks and white folks, but we have brown folks, we have brown Asians, we have East Asians, we have an indigenous folks, Latinx, people who are biracial and multiracial, that this work needs to be inclusive of all of that. And I know how big and overwhelming that can seem, but also to recognize that you can start small. Like, everybody needs to have some sort of access point, if it's, reading a book or watching a documentary, but whatever information you're consuming, to think about what is the next like actionable step you're going to take. How are you then going to be in community with other people to use what you're learning, so you're not just constantly consuming information? I think for folks within the Jewish community, considering, something I've talked about with synagogues before is like welcoming practices. If you have people who are new to your congregation, I know that like my mom is one of the people at our synagogue who tends to like welcome new folks like on Saturday morning services.
So is my mom.
Like, is there bias in how we greet people who we don't think like fit the norm of what Jewish looks like too? Like, as an Asian Jewish person, I have been in many different synagogues where people will say things like, "Welcome, we're so happy you're here," but then make the assumption that I'm not Jewish, or that I must be married to someone Jewish, or that I'm here with a friend, or I've never been here before, when I actually come here like all the time. And so just to be really mindful of like those messages, regardless of how like well-intended they are, how they might actually make Jewish folks of color or other people of color who don't identify as Jewish feel in those spaces.
And you mentioned, there's a lot of resources out there. I just shared a link to your website, and you have a tremendous amount of resources on there, including a new guide for schools. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's a book I wrote more than a guide. Oh, I guess like guide is in the title.
Yeah.
This is the product of a couple of years worth of work. I started this I started the actual writing process like maybe 2 years ago. And all the chapters in the book are focused on like proactive ways that educators, caregivers, school staff can engage in anti-bias and anti-racism work within classrooms and school buildings. Um, I 2 years ago asked on like Instagram stories, like, hey teachers, if you want to be doing like anti-racism and social justice work in your classrooms, but you're not, tell me why you're not. And got hundreds of responses and was able to go through like what everyone said and also sort them into different categories. And those categories of responses actually form the chapters of the book. So for teachers who said, my administration's not really supportive, or I have a lot of really vocal parents who like aren't into this, or I teach first grade, so like what the heck does this look like if my kids are so young, or I only teach math and science, which seem like really objective subjects, like how can I incorporate this into my work, or even I'm a white teacher and like I'm terrified, what do I do? So I'm hoping that it is just like a very proactive tool that folks feel empowered to use, that they could implement one of the strategies or practices like tomorrow in their classroom if they wanted to. It's meant to be very practical and hands-on. I share a lot of anecdotes and samples of student work as well as lessons that I've done with my own kids over the past years. There's also a lot of organizers and templates, so teachers can really try to start like embedding this lens into their practice.
And I noticed also on your website, you also have like curriculum resources and things like that, which is incredible. I'm curious if you could give me an example of something that has come up with you and your students, maybe this past year, or whatever it is around that, that is about the topic of racism and how you handled it.
Sure. This year. So I can give an example from the past few weeks. So after the shootings in Atlanta, where those 6 Asian women were murdered, it was really hard to like show up. Granted, like I know we're on Zoom, but just like to have the physical and emotional energy to get in front of students and put on a face. I don't believe in like pretending that everything is fine. I was really transparent with my students. They're 6th graders. About how I was feeling and what was happening, and they were extremely like empathetic and very caring. But as an English teacher, we were in the middle of a poetry unit, which we just recently wrapped up. So I'm always looking for ways that we can use a lens of anti-bias and anti-racism into what we're already doing. Because I know for teachers, we're very strapped for instructional minutes every day, and it shouldn't be something where you feel like I can either talk about anti-racism or I have to teach my subject. Like you can do both at the same time. So within this poetry unit I decided to weave in Asian American history and talk about what was happening in our country by having a lesson around what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, around like the internment camps, how they were targeted and singled out just because they looked like a nation we were fighting with across an ocean. And many of my students had no idea that this even happened. But to tie it into English, to tie it into poetry, the poems that we analyzed that day were all written by Japanese Americans who were imprisoned during World War II. So there were a couple of haikus. There was a really beautiful poem about the fence that enclosed the camp, as well as a couple of others. And it was really cool to be able to, explain to students that there are ways to engage in this work that are relevant to our content, and also to tie in history. So I think it went really well, and I got some really great feedback from students afterwards.
Well, they're incredibly lucky to have you as a teacher, via Zoom or otherwise, when there's, obviously so many teachers are struggling right now, and to be able to like provide a meaningful experience right now is an incredible gift. So thank you for being a teacher and thank you for caring so much. As a parent, I appreciate it. So just, and these are things I think, you do list on your website, but are there certain books that you recommend, like that you read with your kids to talk about this topic that are helpful?
Sure. So with younger kids, a book that I really love is called All the Colors We Are. I believe it's also a bilingual picture book. But when we talk about race in class, and remember, like I've taught first through sixth grade at this point, the way that I'm going to approach it with sixth grade might look different than first graders. But once I collect information around what my students already know, I might actually have a lesson that looks very similar to a first grade lesson with sixth graders. Um, I really like the book All the Colors We Are because it talks about why people have different skin colors from like a very scientific perspective. Like it explains what melanin is. It talks about, depending on where your ancestors lived in proximity to the equator, you might have darker skin, you might have lighter skin. And we also get our skin color like from our ancestors. If you have one parent with dark skin, one parent with light skin, like your skin tone may fall somewhere in the middle. And to just give this very scientific explanation to kids before they consume a lot more information, that is often full of biases, that skin color means that we are like inherently different from each other. And I think it's really important for kids to know that concepts like race and gender are socially constructed. And if we can introduce those ideas to kids when they're really young, I think it really shifts the dialogue of how we talk about social identifiers and how different systems of oppression exist and why they exist too. Like if you tell a kid race is a social construct, the only reason we look different is because we have different amounts of melanin in our skin and we come from different places around the world. Creating systems of oppression based on this seems like utterly ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous to adults, and kids are just like, how is this a thing? Like, how has there been so much built up on these ideas? And ways that we talk about it, like in terms of gender or race, to prove that it's socially constructed, is I will often use like primary sources like the United States Census and how like racial classifications have changed so much over time. And that's a really great piece of evidence to show like our language and understanding is changing. And also depending on where you live, these definitions mean different things. Like even within my identity as an East Asian person in the United States, I'm considered a person of color. In the UK, Asian typically means people of South Asian descent. When I was in a fellowship in South Africa, East Asian folks have white people status there. So it depends where you are. It depends on where you are in time as well. In terms of like gender identity and gender expression, looking at, outfits and clothing that are deemed traditional all around the world. And so like our ideas of what is feminine or masculine within the United States or like Western European culture is very different than what Indigenous folks believe, than Asian folks believe, or folks in Central or South America. And being able to give these visuals and examples to kids helps them understand that we're also products of our environment.
Yeah. And that being said, you are teaching these kids who are going to be the next generation and teaching their kids and so on, Lador Vador. Do you feel that we're trending in a positive direction in terms of, anti-bias, anti-racist behavior in the next generation growing up?
I think so, because I think kids have a lot more access to information and tools and experiences that are really different from their own, like through, social media, through tech. I see schools kind of going in very different directions. And I'm sure if folks like, follow stories in education and like mainstream news, you'll see schools that are really trying to buy into anti-racism work. I've heard so many schools talk about, last summer we did a book study on Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, or like Bettina Love's book around like abolitionist teaching. So I think that some schools are really leaning in hard to that. And then you also see schools who are like, this is like hyper political. We're not getting into identity politics. People want to like outwoke everybody else. Like we're trying to erase like traditional American history. So like obviously with a certain type of progress, we're going to see like a similar type of pushback too. So I do think both of those things are happening right now as well.
And like you said, I guess it also depends where in the country you are, where in the world you are. Can you speak a little bit about what anti-bias means versus anti-racist?
Sure. Oftentimes I prefer the term anti-bias because so many folks tend to argue about like, what does racism really mean? And like, who could actually be racist towards another person? When I think about anti-bias and anti-racism work, I think the most important thing to focus on is that how they're both rooted in action. Like a problem that we often see with ally is that people see it as like a descriptor of like, I am an ally versus thinking about the action that you actually need to be an ally. When we are thinking about anti-racism work, I think a lot about white supremacist beliefs, characteristics, and culture, and the things we say and the things we do every day to uphold those systems and beliefs. And when you are being actively anti-racist, you are doing everything you can to dismantle those. If it's in conversations, if it's in your workplace, within your family, the way you're raising your children, the way you're engaging with politics. When it comes to anti-bias work, there are so many different types of bias. Like racial bias is just one type of bias. You can have bias based on anyone's social identity markers, religion, gender, sexuality, disabilities, body type, language, class, like education level. There are so many different types. Anti-bias work can often be really uncomfortable because in order to dismantle your biases, you have to be aware of what they are. And we all want to think good things about ourselves, you know, and like the people that we surround ourselves with. And so being able to identify what our biases are in order to push back against them. There's a lot of like learning and unlearning. And oftentimes the unlearning is harder because we have such deeply embedded ideas of how we think about people and communities and different concepts. And perhaps we've had these types of thoughts throughout our entire lives. And suddenly you're 30 or 40 or 70 years old and realize that a belief you've had your whole existence is wrong and harmful. And I would encourage people who are, digging into this work to not, back away from that discomfort. That discomfort is such a necessary part of being actively anti-bias and anti-racist.
Absolutely. In your TED Talk, which was so beautiful, you spoke about how you had students that were not necessarily comfortable, bringing up topics in front of the entire class that they knew they were ignorant about, like, what does LGBTQ mean? Or, it seems like maybe there's people in other countries that are racist too. What's that about? So for someone that does feel like they're ignorant about another culture, do you have recommendations about how they can broach this topic and learn more?
I mean, if you're not part of a certain identity or community, you are inherently going to be in the bucket of people who are going to intellectualize all of that information about another person. And that is just how it is. I would suggest going towards resources. We call them like own voices, meaning that folks of a certain identity are the ones telling that story, telling that history. So if you're learning about Asian American history, please learn it from someone who is Asian American. Like if you're learning about Black history, please learn it from people who are Black. And so making sure that you are double checking your resources, the organizations that are putting them out, or the authors or the scholars who are creating them, to make sure that you're also aware of what their identity markers are before you, I think, invest a lot of time and energy into them.
That's good advice. I think about yesterday, my family is Jewish, and we spent yesterday with my daughter's best friend's family who is celebrating Easter. And she's in kindergarten, and she was so excited to learn about Easter. And she's like, it's so cool that I get to learn about this other culture. And, we can, and then my friends can learn about my culture. And like, she's at this point in her life right now where it's just like exciting. And I also I want to help promote that and learn about other cultures, but also in a way that there's not like that cultural appropriation. So I'm just curious if you have advice around that. Like, is it, okay for her to learn about the Chinese New Year in a way that she's not like adopting it as her own?
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to have students differentiate between appropriation and appreciation, like you can learn about any, like we should learn as much as we can about other people, but what we claim as our own or that we have the right to participate in too, I think is where people often get a little confused and like no one likes being told what to do. So if you're using like Lunar New Year as an example, like you can read books, you can look for, celebration, like public celebrations that might be going on in your community, rather than if you are not of the descent of a country or nation that celebrates Lunar New Year, maybe you're probably not going to decorate your house that way. You're not going to wear like the traditional clothing or things like that. So I think making sure that there's that distinction is really important too.
When is the right age to talk about cultural appropriation?
Well, I honestly think at any age, just because it depends on like the language and the examples you're going to use. I think like with young kids, like Disney costumes are maybe like a good place to start as examples. Like if a child wants to dress up as, Moana, for example, like from that Disney movie, where it may or may not be appropriate. Like, yes, she's a fictional character, but she also like represents this very specific like Pacific Islander nation and culture. And how do we feel about people taking up our clothing, our language, and our beliefs when we know they don't identify that way? I think just inviting kids to ask questions and to engage in the discussion. You don't have to walk away with a definitive, like, you must do this or you must not do this, but like encourage them to embrace the nuance of the conversations. Because I do think that is something a lot of adults struggle with. Like a lot of adults say, just tell me what to do. I just want to know, is this okay? Is this not okay? And being able to sit in that discomfort and to hold multiple truths at the same time is something that we can definitely start engaging with kids.
Awesome. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know your time is very limited. We're so grateful that you're here today. I'm curious if you have any, last words of wisdom to our community that we can take with us.
Yeah, I would just say, dig into the discomfort and understand that if you are brand new to like anti-bias and anti-racism work, that's okay. Like there's a different starting point for everyone. And it's more important about building capacity so we can be in community with each other. I would also say that just to be really mindful of how you emotionally, mentally, physically react to moments of shame or embarrassment, because I do know that there is a lot of those feelings that tend to pop up in this work too, especially as I said, when you start to recognize that you might have been engaging in harmful or problematic behaviors. Use those as learning opportunities and experiences. And I've often found that those teachable moments are the most meaningful ways for me to engage with people who are newer or more uncomfortable to this work, because vulnerability is such a big piece of this too. So I guess just also remember that if you are asking people to share themselves in a certain way, that you also need to make that offer as well.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for teaching us and for being with us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And have a beautiful day. And please look up Liz's website, go there, learn. There's a lot of resources.